In the early years of the 20th century, Europe saw profound changes in culture, politics, technology, and the economy. The First World War weighed heavily on nations with the toll of battle, throwing countries like Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary into turmoil. Some of these nations self-destructed. Others picked themselves up from the destruction. Some saw decline, some growth. The 1920s was diverse in its effects, and diverse in its natures. Oh, hello! Didn't see you there. Here today we take a look at the different aspects of life during the 1920s. From popular culture to the radical political changes throughout Europe. I introduce you to the Decade of Decadence.
The decade following the war saw the rise of many new movements in the arts. Surrealism stands out among them as a jumping-off point for many other movements and a style that captures the mindset of Europe after the war. The movement began after World War I as artists saw an excess of rationalism as harmful to the state of human minds and the main cause of World War I. People turned to a deeper understanding of human thinking for a base. This was expressed in art, film, and even politics as the movement progressed. Art Deco is another movement from the era, drawing on the new modern spirit that came from the aftermath of the war. Egyptian themes and streamlined figures were essential parts of its modern character, and was present in clothing and architecture especially. Music in the 1920s came mostly from American influence in Europe. African Americans, who were discriminated against in the country they were from, went to Europe, especially France, as discrimination was very limited. Women's clothing became simplified after the war, and as suffrage was gained in multiple nations. The new clothes reflected the new role of strong women in societies. Clothes lost their heavy complexity and became light and streamlined, reflecting the influence of the Art Deco movement. Dresses became shorter, and swimsuits for women were also invented. The 1920s saw the advancement of film, as it more and more became a respected art. Film had existed prior to the decade, but made huge advancements in the form of the invention of sound for film and color film.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you ain't heard nothing.
These two inventions together soon eradicated silent film as an art, becoming prominent very quickly. Women in the 1920s asserted a new, more dominant role in society, in part due to the new political role they gained with the granting of women's suffrage in some nations across Europe. At this time, women began to assert a new sexual role, as well as they embraced the Freudian idea that all people had sexual desires, even women, and that these urges were not something to be hid. They flouted social and sexual norms and became promiscuous in the eyes of the previous generation. Literature grew in volume and importance as people learned to derive new opinions and meaning from the writings of the authors of the times. Many of these authors delved deeper into the new ideas of philosophical meaning, this group being called the Lost Generation. A movement created around this time was Surrealism. Examples of these authors include Paul Valéry and Marcel Proust. Valéry wrote his essay Crisis of the Mind, commenting on the general mood of those in war, who had seen its horrors and atrocities. Proust wrote his most famous masterpiece, In Search of Lost Time, in a series of 7 novels from around the beginning of the war to the Great Depression, bringing about many newly discussed themes into the plot. These authors both had in common a use of the new ideas and views of the era, and what the repercussions of said era were. Existentialism was a philosophical movement that came along with the 1920s. This movement was based on a belief that all deeper thinking begins with the human subject. Many of these philosophers did not believe in God, but some did, with most having very distinct interpretations of human nature. One of the most influential of these existentialists was Friedrich Nietzsche, who declared that God was dead. Another notable existentialist was Jean-Paul Sartre, who created a more practical approach to existentialism. What these authors had in common was a mistrust in the institutions that they felt overstructured human nature, bringing about the war, which characterized the view of Europeans in the decade.
While some countries thrived and others withered during the 1920s, Russia's economy had experienced mostly recession. Russia's economic struggles were exacerbated by 3 specific events in the early 20th century. First was the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in Russia's humiliating defeat, increased economic recession, and led to the Revolution of 1905. Second was the Great War in 1914. Russia's poorly organized economy couldn't supply its massive army, which forced them to establish a harsh peace with Germany and pay immense reparations. Finally, the Russian Civil War, during which the Bolshevik Party gained control and then had to fight the White Army, which devastated the Russian economy. In the years leading up to 1920, Russia's economic output was less than 20% of the pre-war level. I had the opportunity to speak to Vladimir Lenin, the esteemed Bolshevik leader, who described the economy in the Soviet Union and his new economic policy.
I attempted to revive Russia's shattered economy by using my new economic policy, or NEP. This policy attempted to implement a more capitalism-based system for our country. I established a mixed economy, meaning individuals could now own small enterprises while the states controlled the largest corporations and banks. Instead of grain requisitions, like the Tsarist government had utilized, I put a basic tax on all farmers. This allowed farmers to keep any surplus grain they had and trade it in as payment, or simply pay with cash instead of having the grain forcibly taken. Once the drought and famine in the early 1920s was finished, production jumped about 40% because of my new tax.
The Great War and its subsequent events had a devastating impact on Germany. Though the Treaty of Versailles established peace, it did so at a high cost. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, was particularly harsh, forcing Germany to accept all war guilt and reparations. This enormous amount of debt, combined with the demilitarization of the Rhineland and the downsizing of its army, downgraded Germany from a major world power to a defeated state, wallowing in despair. Though the Dawes Plan proposed an effective short-term solution for Germany to repay the war debts, it soon became clear that even with loans from the United States, Germany would not be able to keep up with payments. The Dawes Plan was replaced with the Young Plan in 1929, which gave Germany a set deadline and reduced payments, but this plan failed overall as Europe and the United States spiraled into the Great Depressions. Reparations had a crippling impact on Germany. They created hyperinflation, where prices skyrocketed while the value of Germany's currency, the mark, plummeted. In 1914, the mark to US dollar ratio was 4.2 to 1. By November of 1923, it took over 4.2 trillion paper marks to match the value of one US dollar. Businesses struggled to keep up with such rapid inflation. Workers began bringing wheelbarrows to their workplaces to collect daily pay, and some restaurants had to change prices every half hour to keep up with the rising costs. Children in Germany often played with bundles of marks, and many Germans used the currency as wallpaper or fuel for fires, so worthless were their savings. Germany began to emerge from its catastrophic hyperinflation in January 1924 when it introduced a new currency. The hyperinflation of 1923, combined with the harsh Treaty of Versailles and the Brüning deflation of the 1930s, created a struggling economy and a downtrodden German state that would readily follow the strong-willed and charismatic Adolf Hitler to regain glory for Germany. After its participation in the Great War, the United States was immersed in what is known as the Decade of Optimism. People reveled in life, tried new things, and spent lots of money. Encouraged by exciting new technological innovations and inventions, people invested their money in new enterprises. During the 20s, there was a general urbanization as Americans and Europeans moved to take advantage of the growing industries in cities. Taking advantage of the booming stock market, Americans and Europeans both invested and made millions in very short amounts of time. It seemed that the market would never stop growing. Unfortunately, this optimism was not to last. During World War I, widespread farmland and massive agricultural production was essential. But as the 1920s began, with a focus on urbanization, many people moved into cities to find work and neglected agricultural development and production. This neglect, combined with drought and poor farming practices, eventually led to the infamous Dust Bowl of the Great Depression. Another factor in the stock market crash, and impending depression, was unwise financial choices. The stock market was booming during the late 20s, enticing people to invest and buy stock on margin. When the market slowed, people quickly sold their stock and made runs on banks, furthering the swift downturn of the market. Millions lost their stock and their savings, and European and American markets alike spiraled into a depression lasting until World War II.
The 1920s saw some of the most revolutionary political events of the 20th century, the birth of fascism and the spread of communism, both products of growing nationalism in Europe post-World War I and would continue throughout the rest of the century. Fascism found its origins in Italy, with the election of Benito Mussolini as prime minister in 1922. Before fascist rule, Italy had gone through a series of weak socialist and liberal parties, unable to control the popular discontent with the Treaty of Versailles. Power was eventually given to the National Fascist Party by King Victor Emmanuel, and with his party of black shirts, the leader Mussolini brought forth a dictatorship which would suppress the people for decades to come. After Italy, fascism spread to Germany, Hungary, Britain, and France, shunning other political ideologies it deemed non-progressive like democracy and socialism. Though it wasn't to last in the Western nations, fascism found a place with the Nazi Party, and later fathered Francoist Spain, and Szilágy's Hungary. The Nazis at this time were also displeased with their failing government, the Weimar Republic. Nazi leader Adolf Hitler rallied support in public speeches and attempted an uprising with a beer hall push, and though it failed, Hitler's call to action spread his fame throughout the nation. This was the first step towards Nazi rule. Popular support for fascism came mostly from war veterans and bourgeoisie youths fighting the social order. The Italian fascists also gained support by making good relations with the Catholic Church. The Lateran Treaties of 1929 and Mussolini's laws gained him many followers. However, fascism only oppressed its supporters, controlling every aspect of their lives and eventually helping to initiate World War II. Far to the east and free from fascist clutches was the creation of the Soviet Union. Russia had already had its hands full with war, enduring partial defeat in both the Great War and, soon after, the Polish-Soviet War. This conflict lasted from 1919 to 1921, and would conclude with ceding large portions of Belorussia and the Ukraine to victorious Poland. However, they would still be considered Soviet republics.
Us Bolsheviks had held power ever since we overthrew the provisional government. That was in 1917. But on December 28, 1922, all Soviet republics unified to create the CCCP. These included the Russian, the Transcaucasian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian socialist republics. Together, we completely restructured the government and economy, mostly working off of the Bolshevik initial decrees signed by Lenin 5 years prior.
From that point, the Georgian Joseph Stalin became leader in 1927, gaining his title by consolidating power and isolating rivals. His rule created a totalitarian state that would last for more than 20 years and would endure 2 wars more. Back in the West, Britain was going through changes of its own. Women's suffrage had already been in full swing through the war years, and already women over 30 could vote. But this law, put in motion by the Eligibility of Women Act of 1928, was drastically changed 10 years later with the Representation of the People's Act. This gave women the exact same voting rights as men did, a great victory after half a century of struggle.
The 1920s was a time of great technological change. This was the time immediately after World War I, a decade of new inventions such as the radio, silent movies, and Henry Ford's automobile industry. The most influential change was probably radio broadcasting. Radio was at first a hobby for engineers and amateurs, and was not expected to have a wide appeal. But by 1922, radio broadcasting was sweeping the continent. It was the first mass medium to bring people to an event in real time, while staying inside their homes. For the first time, people could hear the voices of famous news broadcasters, as well as hearing famous singers, comedians, preachers, professors, and celebrities. Radio also brought useful information like news, weather, and sports, and in a society where few people traveled long distances, radio took you to faraway cities. In addition to radio, the 1920s saw the arrival of talking pictures and movies that had dialogue, which meant that news serials could now have narration, and plots of films could become more complex, since people didn't have to read title cards to find out what the characters were saying.
New number this morning. Would you like to see the girls run through it? Yeah, sure. It's a great idea, Philip. Pep this party up. Go ahead.
Developments in television also laid groundwork for commercial use of these important products in the 1920s. Communication was also advancing as a result of more cities having telephones and the gradual development of long-distance service, which, although it was very expensive, was welcomed by businesses. For transportation, aviation was improving gradually as adventurous men and women were taken to the skies for flights over increasingly longer distances. Automobiles could now go faster, which made it easier to get from one city to another. While Ford Motor Company was founded in the US and is known throughout the world as an American brand, the company's history in Europe closely parallels its American heritage. From the arrival of the first Ford cars in Britain in 1903 to the present-day European organization across Europe. Until late 1927, the European operation was based on the Model T, which was taxed heavily on engine capacity in European markets. And from being the world's best-selling car, Model T's sales fell apart as other automobile producers offered smaller, lighter, faster cars which were more enticing to the general European public. Several medical inventions also contributed to the rise of the 1920s, like insulin for diabetics and others, whose bodies could not create the hormone that normalizes blood sugar levels, or penicillin, an antibiotic that among the first drugs to be effective against many previously serious diseases, such as syphilis, and the iron lung, used to help those who can't breathe using water pressure. As gangs and the mafia increased in Europe, the Tommy gun was invented, the first public automatic rifle that citizens used amongst and against each other. After World War I and the creation of the tank and the combat airplane, Europe's style of warfare was changing, where technology guided the way. The invention of the analog computer introduced the ever-changing aspects of physical phenomena such as electrical, mechanical, or hydraulic quantities. With this came the first prototypes of liquid-fueled rockets and the jet engine, which furthered aerospace technology. Other everyday appliances were also invented, like the electric shaver, the self-winding watch, the traffic signal, the aerosol can, and the mechanical television. The use of machines in industry had been mainly for production purposes since 1928, but we now go to a new development in England, where the first working android has been created.
Benjamin! It's finally complete! A robot programmed specifically to kill fascists!
Excellent! Humphrey, throw the switch! Finally, we now have absolute power when we destroy those totalitarian brutes.
Keyword, absolute power. Read. Fascist detected. Terminate. Terminate.
Overall, the 1920s saw much change in technology, as just after the First World War, Europe needed improvement in society, which gave way for a thriving industry.
During the 1920s, there were vast economical and political changes, and these changes were affected by and visibly represented in culture and technological advancements. We thank you for watching our opening video, courtesy of Russia, and please, enjoy your time here at the Decade of Decadence Museum.